economic access as a method for encouraging medical decisions is a form of violence against a populace, and Cooldog's going to be taking the opposition. It'll just be a normal back and forth debate as always, and there will be no moderation, and there will be a voting poll at the end if there's no concession from either Koco or Cooldog. So thank you both for debating, and Koco, since you're taking the affirmative on the prop, if you want to open up, you can go for it.
Cool. I haven't taken the affirmative on a prop in a long time. So I do want to lead just by saying that this debate is essentially about vaccine mandates, but I'm not interested in making any claims or debating the particulars of the mandate itself. I don't want to spread any misinformation on accident. I myself am vaccinated. I'm okay with disclosing that information. I still feel pretty strongly that mandating any kind of medical procedure is not a good thing. But I just wanted to make sure I led with, I'm not here to rail against it or spread any information or misinformation or be like some weird conservative talking head. So I'll go ahead and do my opening statements right now. The question of the government's purview within the choices of individuals in regards to their own safety and its relationship to the safety of others is not one to be taken lightly. There have been numerous occasions in which the rights of an individual to the autonomy of making choices for their own safety have been violated by the government. Seatbelt laws, gun control laws, helmet laws, and vaccine mandates for admittance into public schools are several examples of this infringement that we currently accept as being tolerable. In the past, these mandates and requirements have been codified through legislation that have had clearly defined consequences. As we move forward into new eras of technology, social awareness, and governance, the ways in which consequences are levied itself also changes. And while it is impossible to estrange force, violence, and oppression from governance or the social contract, it is undeniable that the attempt to circumvent the use of force through other methods of pressure and violence are becoming more prominent in the approach of governments have to lawmaking and to law enforcement. Governments such as Australia, and even to some degree America and Canada, have begun to redirect the force and violence of enforcement onto the shoulders of the perpetrators of social contract, but especially onto the shoulders of businesses, so as to circumvent in some way the responsibility of their tyranny in favor of allowing other entities to violate the private rights of individuals within a populace. Despite shifting the responsibility of enforcement onto the shoulders of businesses, which we saw throughout the miscellaneous shutdowns in America, the government cannot absolve itself of any of the violence necessary for enforcement. This current approach to enforcement is at best a haphazard method by which the government can avoid taking blame for the violation of basic human rights, such as the right to choose to participate in medical procedures and/or trials. One proposed instance of this is currently occurring within the borders of Australia and has spread throughout most of the Western world in the form of vaccine mandates. The selected methodology for enforcement of these mandates has often not fallen onto the shoulders of executive governments, like police forces or anything like that, but has instead fallen into the laps of private businesses who are encouraged either through social contract or written legislation to deny access to goods and services based on vaccination status. And while the burden of enforcement has in fact been shifted, the fault of the violation still falls on the governing body. Denying individuals opportunities for economic mobility and necessary goods and services, for example, groceries, medical care, etc., based on the status of an unnecessary medical procedure is no different than forced relocation, as it creates the same hierarchical disparity despite the lack of apparent force involved in their implementation. In addition, restricting or even completely removing access to the means by which economic resources can be acquired based on this criteria is no different than denying access to basic resources needed to sustain life. And by not providing alternatives, the government is in a sense directly responsible for individuals who suffer under these restrictions. And to deny that forced relocation, forced starvation, or forced impoverishment is not violence is, in my opinion, totally nonsensical. And that concludes my opening statement.
All right, great. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm having to manually do my microphone for my OBS, but we'll suffer through it. So I'd first like to thank everybody in the audience. We have a pretty good audience here, and I'd like to thank my opponent for his eloquent speech, and I'm sure we're going to have a great clash in this debate. So I would like to start with sort of my own first four contentions, and then I'll get to the on-case stuff. So the first thing I want to do is a little bit of propositional analysis, and I hate to go to semantics, but I think in a debate like this we kind of have to. So I want to argue that violence is always active, never passive, right? So there has to be an active violence against somebody. For example, if you see somebody assaulting someone else and they end up killing them, you were not the one who ended up killing them. That can't be violence. Otherwise, we're in the absurd position where language is violence, non-action is violence, etc., etc. So violence is always active, not passive. There has to be like a literal violent act that's happening. Simply passing a mandate and allowing businesses to restrict and not take someone's credit card does not constitute a direct act of violence against somebody. It might be considered oppressive, but it is not violence in and of itself. Two, let's do a little hypothetical here. Imagine a disease, we'll call it disease X, where there are carriers and then people will die who are not carriers. And if you are a carrier of this disease and you know you have the disease and you go about spreading this disease to other people, that I would consider a direct act of violence, because you yourself, by exposing other people to it, are directly harming them, right? And that's what demarcates violence. And it doesn't seem it wouldn't be immoral, right? It would be immoral to go out in public with a disease that you know could kill people, right? And it doesn't seem to be the case that asking and perhaps forcing someone to stay home to prevent violence against other people due to spreading this disease is in any way morally wrong or constitute a violent act or even an oppressive act, right? And this is my third contention here, right? Is we lock people out of economic activity all the time for endangering the public, right? We put rapists and murderers in jail because they are a danger to the public. And we think that this is a justified use of the state to keep dangerous people away from the public, right? And this is no different when we're talking about vaccine mandates, right? There's certainly a realm of justified restriction of violence here. Secondarily, we need to talk about, and this might not come up in the debate, my opponent might grant this and we can talk on this level, but it seems that, at least to me, that violence against, and this is again back to the proposition, that violence against a collective group of people like the populace is a fictitious abstraction, right? We need to talk about as on the individual level, right? Does it really constitute a violent act if a business refuses to serve people, or if the state mandates that you get certain vaccines or do certain medical procedures all of the time, right? And it doesn't seem that we're doing a violence against the public. And we need to go down to the individual level and ask the question about why preventing people from doing violence against others is morally wrong in the case of the disease. And then sort of lastly of my own contentions, right? We can run another hypothetical example where we clearly see that this is allowed. We have a delusional, erratic person hopped up on drugs or whatever, or is just clearly delusional, flailing about frantically, right? We do more than just restrict economic access, right? We strap them down to a hospital bed, right? We treat them and we keep them sanctioned off from the public due to a medical problem that they have. And not only do we think that this isn't immoral, but we think it's the right thing to do for people who are in delusions, right? And so now going on to what my opponent says, I do agree that we're seeing an increased amount of state restrictions and seatbelt and restrictions on medical decisions. Well, I may agree that something like a seatbelt, which only harms you, might be an overstep of the state. I'm willing to cede the libertarian point here. When we're talking about things that directly harm others and not just yourself, there certainly is both a public and individual interest in people following good moral guidelines, right? Secondarily, when you say that government has levied force against the businesses, or they de facto have to levy some type of force against the business, this simply isn't true, right? imposing fines or taxes on a business certainly does not constitute a direct act of violence, especially against an abstract entity like a business. Right. How this constitutes a direct act of physical violence against people is quite frankly beyond me. Right. In denying people based upon vaccination status, again, when you talk about the Australian example, or other such examples in other countries, right? I still think that there's yet to prove that we have directly done physical injury or harm against people directly by such an action, right? We're not punching them in the face, right? I would like more clarification on this forced relocation point. I would agree in principle that if you picked somebody up and handcuffed them and moved them to a different location, that this would in fact be an act of violence. But I don't have a comprehension about why denying economic service constitute as such. Right, and then furthermore, when you talk about forced starvation, right, we also have to take into consideration that spreading potentially more deadly diseases than COVID. We can talk about this in principle without getting into the specifics, right? But something like polio, for example, or in previous times when we didn't have as good medical technology, it seems to me to be more the case that the person who goes out into the public knowingly with a deadly virus is more clearly doing an act of violence than telling them to stay home, right? And so I need some clarity on this distinction. At any rate, I'll cede back to my opponent, and I look forward to a great clash during this debate.
Did you say clash or class? Because you are,
CLASH. Clash.
Cool.
Clash of ideas. Rawr.
Rawr. Yeah. So the first thing I'd like to go kind of point by point with your contentions, if that's okay.
You bet. Let's keep it structured. Let's go.
Okay. So the first one that you wanted to clarify was like the idea that violence has to or cannot be passive.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, so I would argue that is not the case. Or actually, I'd be willing to cede that, but what I want to say is that, so let's propose the hypothetical here that I'm kind of talking about is that, let's say you're not allowed into grocery stores and the government hasn't provided any kind of alternative for individuals who've not elected to receive certain medical procedures. If you're not allowed into grocery stores, which are the only place that you can feasibly get enough food to feed you and your family, then how has the government not actively prevented you from acquiring the things that would allow you to continue to not experience bodily discomfort or pain? I think that seems like a pretty active methodology of violence, does it not?
Well, I mean, here I'm just forced to disagree, right? Because the state doesn't have to be the actor here at all. Right? It can just levy a fine on the business, which is not a violent act. Or it can revoke its business license, which is clearly an abstract action that then later the violence will happen to the business, but not to the individual who is being denied service.
Right, but you're incentivizing the business to act in a way that incurs violence on the individual, because the individual is experiencing some sort of harm to their body. Some sort of physical harm to their body is occurring based off of the incentivization of the government. That seems pretty active to me.
Yeah, but again, the question is, how is denying you something an action of violence? I'm just saying I don't want to do business with you.
Right. And I don't want to go back to the the homosexual wedding and the baker who didn't want to make a cake for the two gay men who were trying to get married. It's like the classic precedent that was set in the Supreme Court that says that businesses are allowed to refuse service based off of whatever conditions they want.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I don't want to necessarily harken back to that, but I think I can kind of address this and also address your last point about asking me to expand on the forced relocation thing.
Sure, let's go.
So so when you forcibly relocate individuals, what you're basically doing is saying you are no longer allowed to participate within the populace. And this is why I said in my opening statement that the government is attempting to defer responsibility. So in the past, Andrew Jackson just sent all of the Native Americans across the Trail of Tears and was like, sucks to suck, which is bullshit, obviously. But that's exactly what happened. So the government can't do that anymore because we exist in a space where we're more socially aware. So the government has to find other ways by which they can circumvent that clear violation of rights, but still separate people based off of certain criteria. And one of the ways in which they're going to do that is by shifting the burden of enforcement from them as a governing body to the private businesses. And so when a private business says you're not allowed to do X, Y, or Z here, in my opinion, that's almost equivalent to forced relocation, because what you're basically saying is you can no longer live here in the way that in a way that facilitates you actually surviving here or you actually prospering here. And so it's akin to forced relocation because it's the same kind of violence. I deny you access to something based off of a certain condition.
So like, I would agree with you. If not, there were clear possibilities in which we could provide for the sustenance of people, right? When we're looking at the proposition in itself, right? You know, I think as the negative, I'm free to say, look, we're not going to allow you to mingle with other people, go to the grocery store, but we'll allow you to make an order for food, which we will deliver to your house, right? And so there's no, I mean, if you're saying in principle, there's absolutely no, or we can do like a UBI, or not a UBI, but we can have a government rations and so forth. Like, there's no restriction on us making it possible for people to live in the country while also excluding them from economic activity.
Right. Well, I did explicitly mention that if the government isn't providing an alternative, then it becomes violence. Because I don't think there's a way for me to argue that, like, if the government were to say, like, we're going to give a subsidy to individuals who have chosen not to get vaccinated or have chosen not to have I don't know, pick any particular thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be vaccinations. Like, let's say it was a medical device that detects like a certain level of something in your bloodstream that they can monitor. Like,
sure, we can pick whatever example we want.
Exactly. I prefer to pick the one that's a little bit more hyperbolic because it might incline people to be thinking or to think along the same lines that I do, because it would sound so sensational that the government should have the ability to implant something in your bloodstream that would detect the presence of a certain thing, because we have no idea if that's what they're monitoring. But regardless, if that were the case, if they were to provide like a subsidized program that says like, oh no, we'll give you a certain amount of money to have your groceries delivered if you choose not to participate in this medical procedure, then I would say that, there's no violence that's occurring there. But the fact of the matter is, by not providing an alternative, they're essentially responsible for actively removing an individual's access to things that they would otherwise need in order to survive and prosper.
So like, look, I think we have to be very clear about this, though, right? In that it is possible on a theoretical level, right, to restrict in toto, in completeness, access to economic activities and still then provide people food, correct? Is that not possible?
To a degree, yeah. To a degree, but like food isn't the only example that I wanted to include here. I'm also including access to like the job market and other things, right?
Right, sure, but if we had good socialist utopia where we say, look, you can get a job, you can do all this fun stuff, but hey, you just have to take preventative measures if you're contagious with a disease that can kill people. That doesn't seem like an act of violence to me, nor does it in more simple cases, right? Let's even say that beyond this hypothetical, which I think is a winner, and I submit to the audience that it is a winner, right, beyond this, let's say that what inside of your framework, right? Let's say we do restrict access to groceries, right? Is the government directly by a representative of the state, like a person in a suit, going up to someone's door and committing an act of violence against them? The answer is no.
Right, but I don't think that we can just remove their responsibility because they've deferred enforcement to another entity. I think that that's unreasonable, and it shifts the way that we view governance in a way that I don't think is something that we ought to accept as a populace.
So sure, I agree with you. If you watch it, let's say you have the full means to stop someone from killing another person, right? You have the full, you have a fucking AR-15 in your hand, right? And you're a good shot, right? And you don't
qualms with murdering somebody.
To stop someone from murdering somebody. Are you morally responsible or to blame in some way? Yes. But did you commit an act of violence against that person who was murdered? No. You did not commit an act of violence against that person.
You see, but I think that that's a little bit different. That's a different scenario than the one that I'm proposing, because this isn't like the principle or the problem of intervention or something like that. It's people use it. Peter Singer is famous for this one. He has the example of the drowning child, and if you don't save the child, even though it would come at no cost to you, would you, or are you in fact responsible if that child drowns? And like, I would answer that, I would say no, because people are responsible for their own individual actions. The child is responsible for the child drowning, or the parent is responsible for the child drowning, if you consider the parent to be the one who's teaching the child to be an active agent. But in this particular instance, I don't think that we can equivocate those two things. I don't think that me not stopping someone who's getting murdered is the same as the government incentivizing businesses to deny access to individuals who haven't elected to receive certain kinds of medical procedures. I think that they're very different from each other.
Right, but this is the function of my disease X argument, right? In that what the government is essentially the person who stops another one from murdering someone, right? So we have someone with a disease, they're a carrier for it, and they're not going to die, but they have a disease which they know that they have, that they can spread to somebody else, and they willy-nilly go out and spread that, right? We would clearly say that it is a moral obligation to stop the murderer from killing somebody by using violence, right? And it seems like equally responsible. It seems like equally morally responsible for the government using methods of coercion and indirect action against the person to stop them from spreading the disease. So I think it's a completely analogous example.
Sure, right. But in the particular instance to what I'm referring to, let's say that the recovery rate for that disease was somewhere between 97 and 99%. Would you think that the individuals who were going out into the public having that disease, do you think that between 0.5 and 3% of the population that would not recover from the disease, do you think that they're actively out there, like, likely committing a murder? I would disagree, because you have a higher likelihood of killing somebody on the street with a car than you do with this particular disease.
Yeah, but this is the same argument to pollute the fucking environment, right? It's like, okay, well, it's not me individually causing the problem, but it's everybody else, right? And again, I think that we still need to not necessarily get into too much of the weeds of weighing the morality here. We're talking about if it constitutes a violent act, right? If it constitutes a direct violent act against this ephemeral abstraction of the populace, to require people to do what is morally correct, right? Why is it an act of violence to use coercion and indirect means to force people to do something when the state is obviously not directly punching people in faces, it's not directly harming people, right? It's doing it so indirectly. I don't think constitutes an act of violence, especially when we're considering that when we take the delusional patient in the hospital example, which I brought up, right? It seems like strapping that person down who is delusional and flailing around wantonly. Right, we don't consider that to be a violent act now, do we? And it seems to be the case that we can think of certain types of diseases, again, appeal to more serious diseases than the hypothetical which suits your case, right? There are certainly some diseases which are very deadly or completely debilitating, right? And it seems reasonable to hold people who do have those diseases in a quarantine, and that doesn't seem like a violent act. In fact, it seems like the opposite of which, preventing violence, right?
Yeah, see, I would disagree with you. I think that to like someone who is out in the public, who is delusional, who is acting erratically, to subdue them is an act of violence. Now, it is an acceptable, quote unquote, act of violence in the sense that it has a likelihood of saving people from harm, right? And I think that maybe the principle that we ought to be talking about here is like more of like at what point is the well, actually, no, there's really, that would be more of a discussion for later, is at what point is this violence acceptable for the government to exact on people? But I would say that it is, no matter what, an act of violence. Violence is a necessity when it comes to governance. You cannot have governance without violence. And so when you're enacting restrictions on people...
I fully agree here.
Oh, okay, yeah. When you're enacting restrictions on people and saying you actively cannot participate in this certain thing, right? What the government is essentially saying is we believe that the likelihood of you causing damage to somebody else is equivalent to a maniac running around in the streets with like a gun or a knife who is inevitably going to cause harm to somebody. And so when they say, you know, you have to get this medical procedure or we'll view you in the same way that we would view an individual who's running around in the streets like a madman with a knife, then I think at that point, it's undeniable that they're exacting violence on individuals, whether that is to pin them down and cuff them or to say you're not allowed to go into the stores that would give you the resources that you need to feed you and your family. I think that those two things are essentially equivalent. I've denied you access to a basic human right, a thing that perpetuates your ability to either act freely or act in a way that solicits the benefit of you and those who you are in charge of.
Could I ask a question? Like, what do you take violence to be? Like, could you give me like a definition of such a term?
Yeah, so I would say violence is any act that would cause harm to an individual, physical or mental or anything like that. I don't think that it necessarily, I don't think that it's limited to physical violence. I'm not talking about physical violence explicitly here, though I would argue in a way this is a form of physical violence because I would equivocate violence with oppression.
Okay, right. Okay, I can accept your definition that violence is that which does harm to an individual. And so now my question is, we have somebody who's hopped up on whatever drug or has some type of medical condition, right? It seems like that letting them roam around is hurting them, right? Allowing them to roam around is harming them, right? It will lead to potential harm, right? And strapping them down does not do harm to them because of the very fact that they would have been worse off otherwise, right? We're creating the best possible world, well, one of the best possible worlds for them when we strap them down, correct?
Possibly, but just because of the presence of one of the best possible worlds doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't violence that occurred. I did not include in my definition of violence that something negative happened. I just implied harm or hindrance. So
right,
I think
but harm,
even if the end result...
But harm, you do harm to somebody when they would have been worse off, or sorry, you're making them worse off than if you hadn't have done it, right? That's what harm is, right? And we're not making them worse off. We're making them better off. Like what?
No, but I don't think that the end outcome is what decides whether or not harm has been incurred. Because it might be the case that like more people will live or they'll have a better life afterwards, but you have harmed their ability to have a certain amount of freedom in this particular instance. Whether or not the outcome is more or less desirable is irrelevant. Harm has been incurred.
But it literally hasn't, right? You're helping them. You're stabbing a needle into their thigh, which alleviates their drug symptoms, right? I mean, under your definition of harm, right, you're doing some act which changes them. Me shooting up the heroin addict with Narcan to bring them off of the high does harm to them because they're not experiencing the pleasure of heroin, even though they would die had I not done that. I'm doing some type of harm to them. I find this notion of it collapses into any act which does anything to anybody else constitutes a harm, right?
See, I don't have a problem with that necessarily because it's not as if existence exists without some kind of violence or consumption or oppression. We all experience these things on a daily basis. We just reclassify them based on the outcome. And it might be the case that the outcome of saving the life of a drug addict who's overdosed on heroin is objectively more desirable. But in that particular moment, that individual's agency has been violated because they decided to take how much heroin it was going to take to actually kill them. You violated their agency and have incurred harm on them. The outcome of it, sure, is positive. That's really great. I don't necessarily want to say that that's a bad thing, right? And in fact, I would objectively say that it's not, right? I would much rather save the person who's too stupid to not save themselves. I think that that is perhaps the right thing to do if there were such a thing. But that doesn't deny the fact that at some point their agency has been harmed, that their ability to make a decision for themselves has been harmed. If I save somebody who wanted to kill themselves by forcibly pinning them down, then I may have in fact solicited a more desirable outcome, quote unquote, but I have harmed that individual's agency to do the thing that they wanted to do in the first place. And I don't think that we can remove the act of harm from us saving them just because the outcome was, quote unquote, more desirable.
I find this just to be a very strange view of what harm is, in that anything that removes agency constitutes a harm, right? I can just think of many, like, so for example, right, I willingly go onto the surgery table to do an operation on me. They're doing some harm to me, right? And that just doesn't seem correct, right? I at least think, and I appeal to the audience sentiment here, that harm really constitutes making them worse off than they would have been otherwise. I think that that's what really constitute harm, because we do many things that under your view would be harmful every single day, when in fact that's like the benefit of life, right? Going on a roller coaster at the theme park constitutes a harm for you because it's psychologically, because of the fact that you can't go on the roller coaster without a security bar to keep you strapped in, constitutes some harm because you want the agency to do something. Like, this seems like that every action then seems to encounter is a type of harm at this point, which seems like the term becomes meaningless. I disagree
with those particular points because there's consent involved in those. I have consented and made the choice to be on the operable. I have consented to the risk. I have consented to, within what is within my purview, that within my knowledge, I've consented to those things. I've consented to getting onto the roller coaster that has no safety bar. I've consented to that risk. I've consented to that violation. But an individual who's forcibly given the drug that might save their life, if they otherwise didn't want to have a life, is being harmed because their agency is being violated and they're being acted upon without their consent.
Yeah, but but people fully have the agency to get whatever medical procedure you want, right? They fully have the agency to decide either I want option A or I want option B, right? And they can make the choice. I don't see the issue here.
Right, but like when the options aren't fully or don't have enough information to support their efficacy, and you are essentially putting people into trials based off of the information that's available, then it definitely it starts to look a lot different.
Could you rephrase this in a word that my my smooth brain can understand? Could you rephrase that?
That's okay. You're not pea-brained at all, man. No self-deprecation in any debate with Keith, or with Koco, whatever you want to call me. When the government is creating legislation that incentivizes businesses to deny economic access to individuals based off of their consent to a medical procedure that is unproven to have the efficacy desired to prevent harm, then they have committed an act of violence, if you wanted to get more specific. So basically, let's say, for instance, that it takes on average 8 years to receive FDA approval for vaccination, or 12 years to receive FDA approval for any kind of medication or treatment. And let's say, hypothetically, that due to the presence of a certain disease, that despite it having a 97 and above % recovery rate, they have issued a mandate that you have to take a certain medication or a certain vaccine in order to participate in the economic structures that you've been able to participate in for your entire life. Let's say that all of those things are present. By not being able to provide the proper information that has been provided for every other drug and vaccine that has almost ever been in existence within the particular bounds of that governing body, they're imparting an act of violence because you cannot give informed consent to that particular thing. And if you can't give informed consent, then that is an act of violence because they're violating your agency and causing harm.
I still think that we're sliding on this term harm, right? So I'm going to ask you this directly. Am I harming somebody when I shake their hand, and in so doing, I move their hand from one location to another location? Is that harm?
Did they volunteer to shake your hand?
No, I had. We both locked hands, and then I moved their hand up and down, right? They didn't explicitly will it, right? Am I harming them? The answer's no. The answer's obviously not.
It's the act of a handshake, so of course they didn't.
Yeah, but they did not voluntarily consent to their hand being moved from one place to another. They only consented to our hands meeting. They didn't consent explicitly to every detail of it. What constitutes harm is some type of being worse otherwise, right? It is a given that you did not act, I would be worse off. And quite clearly, in the medical cases, when we're talking about, like, for example, we just talked about this in Serious Saloon before this debate, right? If there's a Jehovah's Witness who happens to be laying down on the street and you don't know it, for example, you didn't know that they were Jehovah's Witnesses, right? Right? You stick them with a needle and you give them a blood transfusion and you save their life, right? I failed to see. Even though you didn't know, right? It seems to me that you didn't do them harm in the same way that me shaking somebody's hand, even though they may not, or accidentally bumping somebody at the fucking bar, right? Like, that doesn't seem like a harm to me, right?
I would argue that accidentally bumping somebody at the bar is a harm, but that's just like a difference between opinions on social norms. But you do you, Cooldog. It's okay. I would say that also that was a joke. I'm not judging you or anything.
No, it's good, man.
I would say that the act of performing any kind of medical care on an individual who is unaware of the medical care that they're receiving, so even if they're unconscious, the desired outcome may in fact be the one that was desired, but you are at risk of incurring or imparting harm onto that individual despite the fact that the outcome is desirable. I think that the outcome is what dictates the conditions of harm. Harm is imparted on individuals who have not consented to a particular action. So if I just stick my hand out expecting you to do a certain thing, I've consented to that particular action within my head. And if you decide to do a different action, then sure, you may have incurred harm. If you want to get into the quantification, I guess, the quantification of harm and like to what degree is acceptable and is not acceptable, that's fine. But it's undeniable that harm has still been incurred because you have violated the consent of the individual who stuck their hand out to perform a particular action with you. In the same way that you would be violating the consent of an individual who is submitting themselves to a particular medical procedure without having enough knowledge to give informed consent to that medical procedure.
So I think that and I hope this fucking audio recording doesn't echo. I apologize in advance. Oh shit. I was muted. Terrible. Sorry. I'm having to juggle. I'm having to juggle muting myself on my OBS to hopefully not cause an echoing problem. I do apologize to the audience at this point if you stuck this long for that. But what I wanted to say is I think we've exhausted this discussion of harm. I think it's up to the audience. If you are persuaded by my definition, which means that you actively have to do something which causes someone to be worse off than they're not, versus a what is tantamount to, in my opinion, any unexpected action towards another person is somehow some type of harm. I think this opens the floodgates for literally anything to constitute a harm that you don't do by your own lonesome, and I think the audience can vote on that. And we can leave it there. I would like to, if you're okay with that, unless you have something else to say on this point.
Just to close out this particular point, because I agree with you, I think we've exhausted it. I'm not going to present any new points or anything. I just would say that in using the word harm here, I'm thinking that, or I'm not trying to imply that it is equivalent to punching somebody in the face. Like, there are quantifications of harm, but the fact of the matter is that it is still some form of harm. And so I would say that this doesn't necessarily supersede the idea that some harm is worse than others, or at least can be measured as being worse than others within a specific lens. Just that harm is present is all I'm trying to advocate for. I'm not trying to say that harm doesn't exist as being better or worse in certain instances, at least to those experiencing it.
So there's one point of propositional clarification which will determine the root of my polemic from here on out, if we can call it that.
Yeah.
So when you, in the proposition, when we talk about, so in the proposition, who is doing the violence, supposedly? Is it the state?
Yeah,
is it bound to the state? Or is it bound to literally anybody who requires certain medical procedures in order to participate in economic activity?
Yeah, so I would say that the burden of violence would fall on the shoulders of the agency that incentivizes particular actions. So if that is the government saying businesses with a certain number of employees have to have or have to require that all of their employees go through this certain medical procedure, then the violence would fall on the state, even though they're not the ones who are enforcing it. Because without the state's actions, then the business may have not elected to do that. But if the business elected to do that without the state's interference, then it would be an act of violence, but it would be in the name of profit and risk acquisition, not in the name of governance, which I think they're two different things those are two different things, in my opinion.
So I will perfectly agree with you that they are different types of action because the agent is different. But what I'm asking at is, okay, let's have a school district that mandates a certain disease, which only, harms children, right? Would that be considered an act of violence for that school district to mandate that its teachers get a vaccination for such a disease?
Oh, so like if it's the school district that's mandating it, then I would
Correct.
say that falls under the purview of governance, doesn't it?
Make it a private school. Make it a private school.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But then the private school is a private entity. And I would say it is in some form an act of violence, but it's one that might arguably be more acceptable because it's based off of the decisions made by the individual stakeholders of that business. It's not a form of oppressive violence. It's just a form of capitalist-based violence, which is something that we experience on a daily basis.
So again, we're at it, and the reason I asked this question, and I think that you're being consistent here, I will say that you are being consistent. Um,
Thank you.
so you're basically saying, look, man, if let's say somebody gets hella drunk at the bar, starts throwing chairs, etc., they're removed from the business, and then and we would kind of both agree that maybe perhaps the removing of them is an act of violence, but then when they come into the bar the next day and I refuse to give them more alcohol because they were, I just banned them from the bar. That banning from the bar, the literal act of not serving them constitutes an act of violence, correct? Under your view?
No, I would not say that it constitutes an act of violence because they're not looking to get access to something that's necessary. So unless they were such a like a hardcore alcoholic that they would literally die if they did not have alcohol, then I would say that it's not an act that's not necessarily an act of violence because you haven't incurred harm on that person. You
But
have
again,
maybe
now
violated their agency or their desire to purchase something, but it's not as if there isn't a free market that exists elsewhere for them to do that. And because you're not a governing agency, it's different. If the government is the one that is denying access and not providing any alternatives, then it is harm and therefore violence. If it's private entities that are uh, denying access without any incentivization otherwise, then that is just the individual choice of that particular entity. It doesn't incur harm or violence because it's not as if they've denied access to that resource entirely. Now, if it was a bar that owned every other bar within a reasonable radius to which this person had access to, and they said he's not allowed, or she's not allowed, or they're not allowed, or whatever, to get alcohol from any of the businesses that we own, and they own all of the places that sell alcohol, then it would be an act of violence and an act of oppression. But again, only if it was access to a resource that if they didn't have access to would otherwise
oh
cause bodily harm.
fuck, I'm sorry to disturb you. I'm sorry. Oh fuck. We looked out there. Sorry for the pause. Nothing was said except me checking to make sure uh life was not lost because that was bothering my brain. But anyway, so I just like at this point, um, it's weird for me to say that. So like the person in the bar example who is refused service, right? That person is being denied part of their agency, and I think that it is entirely irrelevant that they're not the only bar in town. In that, right? In that they want a beer at that specific place at that specific time in such and such a way, right? They're having a specific thing denied from them, right, by the business, which, under your view, anything that in any way is unsurprising to the agent and isn't explicitly consented to constitutes some type of harm, right? Um, right. Why aren't they harmed in that they were denied something that their agency wanted, right? Do you understand?
Yeah, so I would say that their agency is definitely being violated. They are being harmed, but because it is not denying them access to a necessity, it's not violence. What I'm explicitly talking about here is the act of a government or an incentivizing agency that prevents access to individuals from things that are necessary. So, in some way, perhaps, yes, this person has been harmed. I don't think that I would qualify it as being the same thing as when a governing agency does it.
So, like, under your view, if I was communist utopia and I gave to everybody food, right, and I provided for the bare necessities of life, right, but I said, look, you can go out and do this other economic activity, well, economic activity in general, pardon, if and only if you get XYZ medical procedure. That would not constitute a harm under your view, correct?
It would not constitute a harm under my view, correct, because the government had provided alternatives. Yeah, this is a caveat that I probably should have added to the prompt that I put in there.
Yeah, because like now I have a counterexample in an abstracto. It isn't in itself a harm, right? We all know that argument. If the audience has a proclivity for pedantry, they can in fact vote for me on this issue. But I think that would be a disservice to the good conversation that we're having. I just want to point that out. If you are of such
and
a
I
character,
should have included that in the prompt. I appreciate your great your what is it? Your generosity there.
Yeah, like don't vote on that. Like I'm winning on the whole harm debate. Don't vote on that one. But anyway, so I still think, right? I still think that the bar. It just seems weird to me that all of a sudden. So like, but then it becomes strange, right? Because you're saying that strapping a delusional lunatic, part of my whatever, my characterization there, but like strapping down a lunatic to a hospital bed constitutes a harm, but then restricting people's access to food in a particular grocery store, when there's one down the road, does not constitute a harm. It's just very strange that some things which directly are a confrontation or are not confrontation, wrong word. It just seems strange that there are certain actions which deny a person's agency, which aren't a harm, and then there are other actions which physically deny agency and physically cause physical pain, which are not harms. Like I don't know. It's very strange.
I would think that it's consistent because it involves the idea of consent and violation of agency. So it's not based off of outcome, right? So the individual who's denied access to certain things that would otherwise allow them to live, for instance, right? If they're denied those things ubiquitously across the board within a reasonable amount of their ability to travel to acquire those things, then they've been oppressed, they've had their agency denied, they've been violated, they've had violence committed against them based off of the mandate that was put in place. But if an individual is, just said that you're not allowed to do a certain thing in a certain place based off of certain criteria, it's not equivalent. It's not the same. And if you're talking about resources that have nothing to do with one's ability to survive and prosper, then I don't think that that's necessary. And I know what you're going to say. Who decides survive and prosper? I get it, right? But I don't necessarily think that you could say that those things are the same. I think that the person who wants to be able to purchase alcohol in a bar, who's being denied access to that, is different than or based off of something that they've done that caused violence.
But we can rerun this example differently, right? Let's say that there's a Kroger, as is in my hometown. It's quite comedic. On one side of the road, there's a Kroger. On the other side of the street, there's a Walmart. Right, let's say a person steals from the Walmart, right? They steal from the Walmart, right? And they're banned from the Walmart. At which point am I causing them harm? Yes or no?
Were those two... Okay, so there is harm that's being caused to those two individuals, right? But I just don't think that it's equivalent to the harm that would that I would qualify as being like violence from the government. Because I think that what I think is the issue here is that we've moved from the original prompt, which was the government is causing harm and therefore violence, to now we're
your
talking
definition
about
of your definition of violence is causing harm, right? Am I correct?
I would say that my definition of violence could include causing harm. I can't remember exactly what I said at the beginning of the conversation. I'm sure that there's somebody in the chat who has a blue display picture who can probably remember exactly what it is that I said at the beginning of the conversation.
Well, again, we can re-ask the question, what is violence then? What is violence?
Yeah, I think that I did say it's something that causes harm to an individual. It actively causes harm to an individual.
Right. So I don't see how we're straying from the prop when your definition of violence is literally that which causes harm. Right. I don't
Okay,
see
well
how
then,
we're straying.
then I'm willing to say here that the private businesses are causing or they're imparting violence onto individuals. I think my point of contention here is that it's not equivalent to what it is that I was looking to talk about. Right? We're in a different arena. Like I think that it's undeniable that harm and violence are incurred upon us as individuals who participate in capitalist societies. That's inevitable. In the same way that harm and violence and oppression are incurred upon us for participating in social contract or in any form of governance. Undeniable that that's the case. There is no evidence to suggest that will ever occur otherwise. But I am not interested in that particular instance. I'm interested in the type of violence that's being incurred on individuals by the government and whether or not that is something that should be acceptable for the government to do. Because I think
Right,
that,
and
unfortunately, the reality is that
I'm just
Mhm.
I'm just very unclear what type of
Right.
violence or harm or whatever word we want to use to describe what's happening. I'm just very unclear on how the government, I mean, we can call it the state or whatever, right? Whatever the
Right.
government is doing directly to individuals that cause a harm, when we both agree that like even the recent like mandate by Biden, that businesses over 100 people have to have like a vaccine mandate, right, I'm unclear on how that does violence directly to the individual when it's obviously the businesses who are the ones enforcing it, and all of the violence seems to happen on the business level, right? So the
Right, but
state
I
isn't
don't
the
think
one
that
doing
deferring
it.
the responsibility of violence from one party to another necessarily absolves the first party from the violent act in itself. They've incentivized or otherwise required an act of violence. That means that they may as well have committed the violence.
So yeah, but violence isn't transitive like that, right? Like it's not.
See,
It doesn't work that way.
I would say that in some capacity it is.
I mean, okay,
And the,
I'll retract that because my brain immediately figured out a counterexample of like, okay, I pushed someone into somebody else. I'm not the one who hit you, right? Okay, like, all right.
yeah,
I'll
stop hitting
retract.
yourself, cool dog.
But yeah, so I think we've done that. The other point I wanted to talk about, which may be interesting or maybe my own my own pet peeve here, is that when you say in the proposition that you're causing violence to the populace,
Yeah.
right? This is like a very strange notion to me that I can cause violence to this abstract entity, which is the populace.
Yeah. I think that that might just be a confusion that I created through my lack of practice in coming up with effective prompts. To be completely honest, when I referred to the populace, I guess part of what I was trying to say was that, like, let's say, for instance, that this particular procedure it does not have substantial enough literature to support its use that you can advocate for its efficacy at a particularly reliable rate. And in addition to that, there isn't enough information on that particular procedure to suggest that it does not cause a substantial amount of harm to a large group of individuals. Then, if you're incentivizing people to get it based off of denying them access to certain economic things, then you are incurring violence on them because you are imparting a higher likelihood of harm onto them as an individual for getting this particular procedure than you would be if you did not incentivize them to get that particular procedure.
Sorry, I had to think for a second.
That's okay. Yeah, let me
Give
know
me
if
a
you want me to
minute.
repeat myself at all. I ask people that all the time, so I have no problem re-saying things.
I'm just still very unclear. So like under your view, right? Under your view, having to get a driver's license is constitutes a harm, right?
Not necessarily. Because getting a driver's license basically is the government putting a mathematical equation on your likelihood of doing something based off of other factors. The calculation is that you have a lower likelihood of harming other individuals on the road if you have completed the following steps in order to get a license. And that likelihood is substantial enough that you can justify that particular thing. But when you can't justify it based off of the statistical evidence of a particular procedure or a particular process, then I would say that you've broached onto violence. I would also be willing to say that in some way, yes, you are violating the agency of individuals and therefore causing harm based off of the things that I said earlier, and yes, therefore it is violence. I would just say it's an acceptable form of violence, and the other one is not.
Like you've been incredibly consistent before, and then like the saying of this is like a little bit like weird because like you're saying, okay, we can do our statistical model or whatever, and violating someone's a 12-year-old's want to joyride or whatever the fuck, right? You're not doing them harm because the likelihood of them causing an accident is sufficiently high enough that it's not harmful to force them to get a driver's license. When in fact, we can think of
honestly. Because you're right, it's super inconsistent. I will retract that statement and say that I would argue that it's an acceptable form of violence versus an unacceptable form of violence. But I feel like that opens up a can of worms that's an entirely different conversation.
Right, which is like kind of like the whole harm discussion that we had.
Right.
Is this can of worms again? Let me see if I have anything else because I think that the reductio has been done.
Yeah. If we're at the point at which we're saying, well, like, what's an acceptable form of harm or what's an acceptable form of violence, then I would say we've exhausted the topic.
That's not the prop.
Yeah, the prop is that violence has been incurred, and I would again, I apologize to the audience and those people who are listening who listen to my point. I would say that I would argue that when you have the statistical analysis that I was referring to, it becomes an acceptable form of violence, but that's a completely different discussion. I would say consistently, to remain consistent with my original statements, yes, it is a form of violence. It's just a form of violence that I don't necessarily think is as oppressive, but it is still a form of oppression.
Yeah, sure. Like I would agree to you that it is a form of like a restriction of agency. Like that's obviously true. It just seems to me, right, that it's weird. If a grocery store closes its doors at 10 o'clock in the evening, right? They close the shop, right? They're restricting and we've all been late to the store, right? We've all been this, right? Or like, oh damn, I can't get to the store, it's closed, fuck, right? We've all had that happen to us, I think, right? And it's like, it seems weird to me to call that an act of violence, the fact that the store closes, right? Because it's restricting my agency to get something that I need.
I would argue that isn't necessarily a proper equivocation because the store choosing to close at a particular time, you've consented within a certain amount of reason to knowledge that stores close at a particular time. There are other options that are available to you. Just because you can't get to the store that you want to get doesn't mean that the store in itself is oppressing you, right? And I think this is where we're getting into the area of where I would say it's different when the government does it than when a private business does it, which you agreed to earlier, that those are two different acts in themselves because the agents are different. When a store closes and there are other alternatives that are still available, then it is not an act of violence or oppression. But let's say that like there's a monopoly there and like it's only Safeways or Vons, right? Those are grocery stores in Northern and Southern California. And let's say that all through California and anywhere within like a 3-hour radius of driving in California, into Mexico and Washington, Nevada, all the bordering states, all of those are Safeways and Vons, right? And they all close at a particular time. If all of those close at a particular time, there are no other options available to you, then it would be some sort of oppression or harm akin to what the government does. and it would be violence in that particular instance. But when you change the agent, and the individual agent who is enforcing these particular things has different methods, different reasoning behind why they're doing a particular action, I think that it kind of shifts the way in which we ought to look at that particular thing. But don't think that a store closing when there are other alternatives available is violence or oppression, because in a sense, you haven't been denied access to anything in particular. Now, if you're a diabetic and that store is the only place that sells insulin over the counter and you can't get it from anywhere else and it closes at a particular time, and you didn't have knowledge that it closes at a particular time, then they've perhaps enacted some sort of violence on you or denied your agency. But if you, as an individual, know when that store closes and you know that it's the only place that you can get insulin from, if you show up after the store is closed, then that's on you. You've incurred violence on yourself. They haven't incurred violence on you.
I hate to do this. I'm gonna definitely lose all of the rhetoric points I've gained, but I'm about to commit an act of violence against my pants if I don't use the restroom really quickly.
I have to pee during these things all the time, dude. Yeah.
So my apologies to everybody listening.
Act of violence on my pants.
All right, violence has been averted. But yeah, it's seeming so. It's an act of violence if I stop you from getting something or doing something that you need to do in order to survive. Correct? That's
yes.
The essence of your point, right? If I do it indirectly or directly, it doesn't matter. It's an act of violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
But now this just seems to me to be the case, and that I'm just struggling to think of an action that I do that does not some way inhibit something from exercising its need to survive. You know, parasympio, when I kill or like, okay, when I clean out my drain, right, for example.
Yes.
I'm doing an act of violence against the poor drain flies, correct?
I mean, yeah.
I mean, like, even if we go to, what are they called? The people who are totally against, I'm gonna have to Google, the Jainists, right?
Jainists, yeah.
Right? It seems like at this point, literally every action I do is an act of violence, and it seems like that your concept of violence itself becomes meaningless at this level, right?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it becomes meaningless. We would enter into a conversation of like the
Degrees
I guess
of violence. Degrees of violence.
The virtuosity of violence, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that your concept of violence and your concept of harm is overly broad, and I think that that's what really the audience need vote on, personally speaking. But I think I can't really think of any other specific points I
Yeah,
have
I think that
against you. I think we've
I'm
covered a lot.
yeah, I'm good to move to closing statements if you are.
Yeah, do you want to go first or second? It's up to you.
I would traditionally go second because I went first with opening statements.
Okay, so you want me to go first? That's cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this was a great debate. I think that we definitely had some direct opposition against each other, and I think it was a very good debate. I would like to thank the audience for sticking with it and my more than cordial opponent. Um, and so, wrapping up here, I think that there are some things that you can vote on are particularly number one if indirect actions constitute violence. So I think that we can think of situations where it is not the government directly that is enforcing violence upon other people. It is through indirect means, and I take a more restrictive view of violence in which it causes direct physical harm to people. I think that like the main clash and the reason that you should really be voting for me here is that the definition of harm that we ought to be using is that had the action not been taken, that the person was worse off than they could have been otherwise. And it seems to be the case that we can pull up a near, we can, two or three dump trucks worth of examples of cases where we can do things which physically displace people or violate their agency in which they are in fact better off. And so I think it's clearly the case that that forcing people to get certain medical procedures, maybe not all, maybe not even the COVID vaccine, that is immaterial. I think that we can think of several types of medical situations in which violating agency, in fact, makes people better off. And furthermore, I think that my gracious opponent's definition of harm and violence extends to almost literally any act which is unexpected or surprising. I think that a surprise birthday party where someone has the shock of being surprised, in fact, constitutes a harm under his view. And I think it is quite frankly way too broad, and I think you should clearly vote for me on this issue of harm. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. A great closing statement, in my opinion. I want to first off say yes. Surprise birthday parties do in fact incur harm and are in fact an act of violence under my definition. So yes, be careful when you select who it is that you're giving a surprise birthday party to, and decide whether or not you're willing to impart harm or violence on them. I will kind of close just a little bit more briefly. I do think that despite the fact that we would typically associate violence or harm with some sort of bodily, I guess, some undesirable bodily outcome being incurred on individuals, that the definition of violence ought to be expanded, because when individuals experience abuse at the hand of a parent or abuse at the hand of not or at the hand of, they can also experience abuse at or at the mouth of individuals. Words in themselves can represent some form of violence, and to say that they don't, I think, is a little bit ludicrous. I'm kind of losing my train of thought here because I kind of went to another place, but I would argue that I don't think that my definition of violence is too broad. I, in fact, think that it incorporates other necessary and valuable things into its definition that give us the opportunity as individuals to more accurately assess the consequences of our actions without unnecessarily inflating actions as being good simply because of the outcome, or desirable rather because of the outcome. And I don't think that by including limiting access based off of by including violence as part of limiting access to necessary things based off of your desire to submit yourself to a particular medical procedure, I would say I would stay firm in the idea that is violence. And I'm kind of really off topic here, so I'm just going to stop my closing statement there and tell everybody that I really appreciate you being here. I apologize for my uncoherent thoughts at the end here.
Well, I think the discourse itself is justification for your position, and I think everybody did well. If you have any questions for the debaters, I guess now is the time. We do have one question from Mr./Miss Tim, and the question is, I think it's for both of us. So the first question is, why should the government be obligated to provide access to private businesses? On what basis is it getting involved at all?
I don't think the government is obligated to provide access to businesses. I think that my point was mainly focused on the idea of the government incentivizing lack of access to businesses explicitly. So it's not that the government is obligated to provide me access to a business. It's that the government is obligated to not incentivize my inability to access a business.
Right, and you know, I think much the same in that I don't think that it constitutes an act of violence for the government to say that, you know, criminals, for example, or murderers should not have access to private businesses. And I think that the government getting involved is like a separate question. I think that that's going to be something like the benefit for society, right? Something along those lines. Tim, are you still in the chat? Yeah, Tim, if you would like to clarify what you're asking or ask it directly, you can press raise your hand, and
raise your hand.
Yeah, I can put you in here so you can give your expression vocally if you'd like to do so. You don't have to. But unless there's other questions, and no, Walt, I'm not going to talk about the ontology of violently peeing my pants. I think we'll put it up to a voting poll. I was not, unfortunately, paying attention to who was here or not. I know Edgar, I know Maximilian, I know Walt, and I know Arco was here. I know Tim was here as well. I didn't see you or Mr. E, but if you haven't been here for if you've been here for less than 45 minutes, you should not be voting. But everybody else who has been here for more than about 45 minutes, you can go ahead and vote. And thank you, everybody, for listening to this debate. And at this point, we can, unless somebody has a comment that they would like to ask the debaters, we can then move to Serious Saloon for that good post-debate chill session.
Oh yeah, thank you, Cooldog. I had a really good time. I appreciated the conversation.
Me as well. It was a very, very, very cordial, and I did enjoy it. It was not time wasted at all. It was a great debate. So yeah, thank you for being here for another Arthuria debate, and we'll see you next time.